I'd like to introduce Wendy Lucas.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all? Are you glad I didn't yell bingo when I came in the room? I have always, all my life, wanted to yell bingo. Maybe at the end. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today about women during the Revolutionary War. I'm excited to share some of what I know. Some of it is from my 25 years in the reenacting community, and some of it is also from a book called Revolutionary Mothers, Women and the Struggle for American Independence, which I brought with me if anybody wants to see it. Unfortunately, very little of what common women, slaves, indigenous women did during the Revolutionary War was documented. Most written documentation of women's lives is about the wealthy women who were educated, because they're the ones that were able to write letters, write diaries, and they're the ones that the newspapers talked about for the most part. So the good thing is, and the problem is with that is if it isn't written down, it didn't happen, is usually the way history works. But the good news is that there were women outside the upper class who did learn to read and write. I mean, we take it for granted now, but it really was uncommon during the Revolutionary War. And there are local and family histories, which are stories passed down through generations, which often tell us about common women's lives. In colonial times, women's work was undertaken in many different settings, but predominantly it was in the home. The women of the house were often responsible for countless tasks beyond caring for her children. She cooked and baked bread at the hearth, which is a fire, not a stove. She preserved and pickled food. She tended the sick. She was sometimes a midwife. She made candles and was responsible for carding wool, spinning it, weaving, quilting, sewing to make clothes and bedding and curtains. She planted, weeded, and harvested her kitchen garden, collected eggs, milked the cows, made the cheese, churned the butter. She also gathered wheat from the threshing room floor, brewed ale, which might have been fun if she sampled it. She slaughtered pigs, salted the pork, made sausages and jerky. She made corned beef and more. At times sometimes she even would work in the fields. Now we're talking about white women. Obviously, with African American women, there were a lot more jobs that they were doing, all of it for no pay, and often without their families nearby. Less frequently, women were employed in the public sphere, in schoolrooms or at the apothecary, in the dry goods store, the tavern or the inn, or they were servants in the house of the wealthy. The African American women slaves did everything that I just mentioned, plus heavy labor and more. And then there were Native American women who lived in entirely different society, with a quite different division of labor. You'll hear more about that. Once the war began, in most cases, white women's roles expanded greatly when their husband went off to the army. They had to step in and direct household affairs, not what they were doing before. They were doing all the work, but they weren't in charge. This is a fun story. It's about somebody in South Jersey down near Cape May. In 1777, Rebecca Stilwell lived right next door to a naval base, a continental naval base. So that was the rebels. One day she saw a British barge approaching on the Egg Harbor River, which is the river that went right past the naval base. She decided, all the townsmen were away, they were all fighting in the war. So she said, well, there's this signal cannon that's out there. It's usually used for other purposes, but she set it off twice. And the British barge turned around and went away instead of coming and taking all their stuff. So she saved all the munitions and she saved all the supplies that were stored in the house right by the naval base. Her sister Sarah is said to have, okay, so it's a legend, it's not written down in history, and a lot of times people exaggerate a little bit, but her sister Sarah is said to have walked 100 miles to George Washington's camp in North Jersey. She wanted to plea for help to get her husband's release from a British prison ship. British prison ships were horrendous. You generally didn't come out of them alive once you went into them. So she had found out that that's where he was, and she went to Washington to ask for help. Washington sent her to New York with an escort and with a prisoner to exchange, and she got her husband back. I don't think they had to walk home. I hope not. There was a Quaker woman named Anna Cooper Whitall. She was a devout Quaker woman, and she lived with her husband and 9 children in a brick house on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River, right next to Fort Mercer. This is also in South Jersey. She refused to leave the house right before she knew there was a battle going to happen, because the Germans had come down from Haddonfield and they were attacking Fort Mercer. So she was inside her house as the war was raging all around her. She's said to have been in the parlor at her spinning wheel when a cannonball burst through the wall. It didn't explode, because that's not what cannonballs always did back then, and she just moved herself down to the basement and kept on spinning. After the battle, though, her home, the whole house, was used as a hospital, which is where she had to tend to all the wounded and dying Hessian soldiers, because there weren't too many Continentals killed in that battle. It's another story. But the Hessians took it really hard. Across the river in Philadelphia, there was another Quaker lady named Lydia Dara. She lived with her husband, and they were next door to a house that the British had commandeered for General Howe, who was the head of the British Army while the British were in possession of Philadelphia. One evening, his officers demanded that they use her drawing room for a very important military staff meeting. Little did they know she was a Continental spy. So she just listened through the keyhole, and she learned that they were intending to attack the rebel army at White Marsh in 2 days. So the next morning, she left the city with a sack. She got a pass because the guy said, oh, she needs flour so she can feed her family. And he gave her a pass. She went out and she made sure the Continentals would know about the British plans. So Washington and his men were sitting there waiting at White Marsh when the British showed up. And they weren't surprised, the British were. Sometimes when husbands joined the Continental Army, their wives went along too. You've all heard the phrase camp followers. Well, it's not what you think. Most of the camp followers were legitimate women who were there for good reasons. There was certainly other things going on, but the majority of camp followers were either the wives of the soldiers or women in there doing business, legitimate business with the soldiers, doing their wash, etc. Mary Hayes Macaulay was one of those women. She joined her husband when he enlisted to serve in the artillery. That's with the cannons. As other wives did, she laundered soldiers' clothes, cooked for them, and nursed them for wages. At the Battle of Monmouth, during a 3-hour-long cannonade, which is the cannons going back and forth at each other and nothing else can happen because they're doing that, she was assisting them by running the cartridges from the box to the loader. And the way that works is the cannon is here. There's a box way back there that has the ammunition in it because they don't want it anywhere near the fire of the cannon. So she would have to grab a cartridge, bring it up, and hand it to the person who stuck it in the end of the cannon before they fired it off. So she's doing that through the whole battle. Supposedly, this is the battle, which was a huge battle, where camp followers who brought water to troops during the battle began to be called Molly Pitcher. Get it? Pitcher of water? Molly. So the women would bring them water during the battle. And as a reenactor, we have reenacted the Battle of Monmouth, and it's always very, 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 very hot, and we're always very grateful for those camp followers who do bring us water, even though we carry canteens. Usually the water in the canteen is so hot that it's no fun to drink anyhow. Many women travel with the Army as laundresses, as tradespeople, seamstresses, sutlers, which are people who sell different things, whether it's thread and needles or anything else a soldier might need, as nurses, as cooks, as spies, as couriers, as scavengers, and even as saboteurs, people who went in and did bad things to the other guys. Margaret Corbin was a nurse who accompanied her husband when he enlisted. While he was defending Fort Washington in northern Manhattan, she was at his side, ready to help the wounded because she was a nurse. He was crewing a cannon, and he fell in combat, but he wasn't dead. She took his place until she too was severely wounded. She showed so much competence and efficiency while manning that cannon that the other soldiers were impressed and told their commanding officer. That began her military career. They let her stay in the Army because she was so good and they needed her. She later became the first woman in U.S. history to receive a pension from Congress for military service. Now, some women disguise themselves as men in order to be with their husband on the field. Anna Maria Lane was the first documented, okay, so there might have been other women that nobody wrote about because nobody found them, but the first time they ever documented a female soldier from Virginia, it was her, and she was fighting with the Continental Army. She dressed as a man, so they didn't know she was a female at first, and she accompanied her husband on the battlefield. She was later awarded a pension for her courage in the Battle of Germantown, which is just outside Philadelphia. Part of Philadelphia now, but it was a separate place. Other women disguised themselves as men in order to receive a rather sizable bounty that you got for signing up to be part of the Army. If they were caught, and they usually were, they would be dismissed, they would be fined, they were publicly whipped, they were drummed out of the regiment, which meant you had to go through the whole regiment while the drummers were playing, and I don't think you got to wear regular clothes. That's all I'm going to say about that. And then they were jailed for taking the bounty on false pretenses. Very rarely, when they discovered a woman, because of an injury, had been fighting, they gave her a pension too. There was a woman named Deborah Sampson. She disguised herself as Robert Shirtlift, and she served in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. After 17 months in uniform, so she fooled them for a long time, she was finally discovered to be female when she sustained her 3rd injury on the battlefield. The other 2 she treated herself so that nobody would find out. After her real identity was made known to her commander, she was honorably discharged at West Point. She did get a veteran's pension from Massachusetts. Now, the next group of women are the women who stayed home, didn't try to join their husbands for the war. They were really vulnerable, especially if their husbands or sons joined the Crown forces, okay, the British side, because they stayed loyal to king and country. They were often the targets of revolutionary governments, eager, very eager, to take away your property, lands, homes, furniture, livestock, and money, and any other possessions. The woman was considered automatically guilty by association if her husband or son had enlisted with the British, because women didn't have minds of their own in that time, they thought. So local enforcement agencies, which were known as the Committees on Safety, emerged, and they secured and insured. So they went and they got you to sign an oath of loyalty, but they also followed up regularly so that you couldn't just sign it even though you didn't mean it. And if you wouldn't sign it, you'd be in a lot of trouble. Now, there was a woman named Elizabeth Carey Wiltsey who was left to manage her family's farm in New Hampshire when her husband went into the King's forces. She watched helplessly as her home was ransacked, her furniture and her winter supplies were all taken, the feather beds were destroyed. The mob even pulled loose logs from the side of her home until the roof collapsed. She had nothing left. So, in cases like this, a lot of times the women and her children fled. They had to go somewhere, and they couldn't stay there because everybody knew they were bad guys. They went either to the nearest place where loyalists live, and loyalists were in control because it went back and forth in all different towns, or they went to a British fort, if there was one nearby, or to an encampment of British and loyalist soldiers. Another place a lot of loyalists went once they were driven out of their homes was New York City, because New York was in British control throughout the war. Over 30,000 loyalists were refugees in New York City by the end of the war. Some of them even sailed to England if they had money left that they had hidden, and some went as refugees to Canada if they didn't. 50,000 settlers went to Canada by the end of the war. Another 10,000 went to the Caribbean, where there were other British holdings, or to England, or to India, or other parts of the British Empire. Now, I told you I'd tell you about Native Americans. In Native American societies in North America, many of them were matrilineal. That means the women were the ones in charge, and the family lived with the woman, and the bloodline was traced through the woman. Clan mothers chose the chiefs and removed them when it was necessary. They were present and participated in formal discussions and diplomacy. The authority and the autonomy that those women enjoyed in Indian societies was in stark contrast to the accepted subordination and economic dependence that British women and colonial farm wives had. There was a woman named Molly Brant. She was born in 1759, and she would become a renowned Mohawk Indian leader and diplomat. Her family practiced the Iroquois form of Christianity, which meant she later became Anglican, and she is thought to have been educated in white schools. However, she maintained strong ties to her indigenous society and culture. At 16 years old, she married William Johnson, Sir William Johnson, who was a widower, and he was the British Crown's Superintendent of Indian Affairs. She was of equal status to him because her father was a chief and her brother was a chief. They had 9 children, 8 of whom lived, which is pretty good numbers for those days. Together, the 2 of them constituted the most powerful political force of the Mohawk Valley. For 22 years leading up to the war, they were indispensable liaisons between the white and the Indian societies. Now, both the British and the Continentals really wanted the Indians to take sides with them when the war broke out. Initially, the Indians resisted, but finally in 1778, the Iroquois Six Nation Confederation split apart. 4 of the tribes went with the British and 2 with the Continentals. Molly, by this point, was a widow. Her husband had been much older than her, but she was a loyalist through and through. Since her husband's death, she had been living back in her native village, which was Kanjahari on the Mohawk River. And all this is going on in the Mohawk Valley in New York, upstate New York now it is. She was responsible in part for the Continental loss at the Battle of Oriskany. It was a really nasty battle, and a lot of people pretty much got slaughtered. And they knew that she had warned the British and the Iroquois that the Continentals were coming, and so she led to that loss. So at that point, she was driven out of her home, the home that she had grown up in, and she went to the Onondaga, which was deeper into the valley up the river. Then after Burgoyne lost at Saratoga, which was the beginning of the Americans doing some things right so that they would eventually win the war. She was asked by the Major John Butler to relocate to Fort Niagara. Now, you know where Niagara Falls is, right? It's right up close to the Canadian border. So that's how far north she was at that point. And that's where a lot of refugees went and then moved into Canada from there. She formerly served as the intermediary between the British officials and the Iroquois, but she really was the de facto superintendent of Indian affairs, just like her husband had been. She was a mediator, a diplomat, a stateswoman, a negotiator, a liaison, and always an advocate for the Mohawk and Iroquois people. She kept the Iroquois loyal to and supportive to the British throughout the war. And this is an 8-year war, so that was a long time. After the war, the British rewarded her with a pension. They gave her a land grant where she had property on the edge of Kingston, Ontario, which was a pretty big place at that time. And they compensated her for her wartime losses. Now, lots of loyalists petitioned the British government after the war for everything they lost during the war, their home, their possessions, their livestock, everything else. It was very hard to get money, but because she had been of such incredible service to the British during the war and even after the war, they gave her the rewards that she was due. Her people were also forced out of New York State at the same time because the war was over and they had been fighting against the Americans. So the British established a Six Nations Reserve, also in what is now known as Ontario. Molly remained the most powerful Iroquois woman up to her death, which was 13 years after the war was over. But she was an exception. The American War of Independence shattered the power of Native American women had held for 2 centuries. Over the course of the war, due to the influence of the British with whom the Indians had sided, roles of women were diminished. Cultural norms of the white world were pressed upon the male Indian leaders, who in turn urged their people to change in order to survive. Indigenous women's roles changed radically, leading to vastly diminished influence in their communities. Now, switching gears again. In 1770, there were more than 47,000 slaves in the northern colonies. They were concentrated mostly in cities like Newport, Rhode Island, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. There were 20,000 just in New York. There were more than 320,000 slaves in the Chesapeake colonies, which included Virginia. The lower South, there were 92,000 just in North Carolina, 95,000 in South Carolina, and there were 4,000 more coming in every year. By 1775, right before the war started formally, enslaved people accounted for 20% of the population of the colonies. Whether free or slave, African American women struggled to maintain their families. In the North, even if you were a free black woman working in the house as a household servant, you weren't permitted to set up independent homes with your husband and your children. You were just expected to do your business but stay in the home. Enslaved women working in the northern households were sold away if they got pregnant so that they would separate them from their husbands and their children. In the South, both armies used escaped slaves, male and female, for soldiers and laborers, and it was a way to get away from your plantation. 2 times the British made proclamations inviting the slaves of rebel plantation owners to leave their homes, their masters, and join the Confederate Army. An estimated 80 to 100,000 slaves deserted their plantations before the end of the war. And they had lots of different ways to serve in the Army. They could serve as fighters. They could be making cartridges for the muskets. They could be tending the sick and wounded, doing laundry, building fortifications, which was really heavy, hard work, digging latrines, repairing roads, acting as servants to the officers, or as grooms, or cooks, or spies, seamstresses, couriers, you name it. There were a lot of people that had trade skills, and they used them for that as well. There were more than 4,000 former slaves, that followed Cornwallis's baggage train, Cornwallis being the main army that was down there at the time. When the British abandoned Savannah and Charleston at the end of the war, 20,000 fugitive slaves left the Lower South with them. They were taken with other Loyalist camp followers to New York City, where many of them were evacuated to Canada, although not all. If an owner came and tried to claim them, although the British were reluctant, they had to give in because the Continentals considered them all property, spoils of war. So there was a lot of argument going on, but many did get evacuated to Canada. Once they were in Canada, though, although they were given property, they were often tricked out of their property and given the lousy property if they got any at all. They were discriminated against, faced regular violence without any recourse, and they were subjected to racial and class hierarchies, which were there just the same as they were back in the United States, what was to become the United States. In the book I mentioned that I researched this about, she said that numerous African American women died of starvation and enemy attack during the war. Many who did win their freedom lost it again, either through violence or trickery or the venality of men entrusted with their care. So sometimes a woman would have gotten legitimate freedom from her owner, and then the men that were supposed to take them to where they could go to live said, "No, it's my slave," and turned around and sold her again. Those who succeeded in getting to freedom faced racial prejudice in the fledgling country, as well as in exile in Canada, as I described. And it all resulted in poverty and injustice. Those who remained in the South and didn't leave their plantation found that the raids of slavery tightened around them after the war. During the war, there was so much chaos going on, and oftentimes when a plantation owner had to move because the Continental soldiers were coming through, they didn't take all the slaves with them, so it wasn't too hard to get away at that point. But when they came back, they held on tighter than ever because they had fewer slaves and they had to rebuild their plantations. So by the end of the war, by a few years in to the time that they were settlers in Canada, in 1790s, most of the African Americans that were in exile there were disheartened. In 1792, 2,000 of them filled 15 ships, and they were going to settle the country known as Sierra Leone. There was a company that was started with the sole purpose of helping African Americans who were in disadvantaged situations go back to Africa and have their lives back again, if you can imagine that. And that was created by English abolitionists. In the author's words, young girls and matrons, school teachers, and African American slaves, wealthy widows, and camp followers, whose stories are preserved in local history and family scrapbooks rather than in scholarly tomes, give evidence that life during the struggle for the control of the colonies did indeed turn their world upside down, as was noted in a famous song of the time. The war allowed and often propelled these women to step far outside their traditional roles as females and perform deeds that surprised them as much as others. But at the war's end, these women returned to their kitchens and parlors, gardens, and to the anonymity that their society considered was appropriately female.